Yeats's poem, by using the example of the fight against the Irish Catholic bourgeoisie, displays the message that not all battles are worth fighting. Yeats makes it a point to repeat the fact that the rebels who fought for their rights wholeheartedly are now dead, and, despite their efforts, they didn't necessarily make their intended impact. Because of the accusatory tone of the poem, it becomes evident that Yeats blames the Irish Catholic middle class for Ireland's societal problems at the time. He suggests that romantic Ireland is dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave, several times throughout the poem, meaning that there is no chance of Ireland going back to its former uncorrupted state. Yeats separates the revolutionaries from ordinary people, claiming that they were of a different kind. He glorifies the rebels and the efforts that they made to change the corruption going on in Ireland at the time. After glorifying their efforts in every stanza, he finishes with the statement, "Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave," which solemnly douses any flame of hope that may have sparked for the return of romantic Ireland. Also, by ending the poem with this phrase, Yeats makes the efforts of the revolutionaries seem worthless. The phrase is repeated 4 times, and it's also the ending to the poem. Yeats repeated it in order to drill the idea into the mind of the reader.
The excluded details of September 1913 are important when trying to understand what Yeats is saying through his poem. He states the names of several of the leading Irish revolutionaries, all of whom are of importance to the cause that Yeats is writing about. John O'Leary, whose name is mentioned the most, was one of the rebels, and he was actually responsible for convincing Yeats to join the cause of literary nationalism, which was most likely the cause for him to write this poem. The other details that aren't mentioned deal with the state of Ireland in 1913. The Catholic middle class oppressed the lower class, and they were very greedy with their money. The revolutionaries that Yeats wrote about were all fighting for an independent Irish republic. None of these details are actually included in the poem, but they play an essential role in understanding the meaning behind Yeats's words.
Through repetition of phrases, exclusion of details, and through the tone, September 1913 displays a message about oppression and picking your battles. The revolutionaries gave their lives when they fought for what they believed in, but they did not consider the true power of their enemy. Maybe the bourgeoisie was too powerful, or maybe they didn't fight long enough, but their impact was not of great extent considering the small amount of change that took place in Ireland after this movement.
At first glance, Child's Parkstones by Sylvia Plath may seem innocent and endearing, however the deeper meaning of the poem is much darker and more sinister, thus epitomizing the turbulent stones in Plath's own life. The message or meaning conveyed in this poem is that everything simplistic that you might see, such as the Child's Parkstone, has its own unexposed history. It is believed that Plath is reflecting on her personal life in this poem. Although Plath was seen as a perfect and model student throughout her life, her spirits were crumbling as she held an uncertain attitude towards the universe. After her father died when she was only 8 years old, Plath spiraled into a depression where her inner demons were exposed. She attempted suicide prior to returning to school, and her marriage with poet Ted Hughes failed, thus returning her back to Boston. Plath had 2 children, and perhaps she wished for them to have less scarred Parkstones than the ones that led Plath to successfully taking her own life. These excluded details are supported in the poem through the descriptive and visual diction with words such as blaze and bonfire, appealing to the unforgiving element of fire. Each stone signified a memory or event, proving that the stones could not be uprooted or removed, much like Plath's own life, events, and depression.
Several literary and syntactical devices are used throughout this poem to help derive the message conveyed. An allusion is used to a founding father, which epitomizes the extent of helplessness of human nature. The Parkstones were crafted as charred knuckle bones from another age or planet, despite the routine and mundane sunrise and sunset that they experienced. The paradox, colored to dull, shows the lifelessness of the stones and how they are using their color, youthfulness, and being stripped of their innocence. There is repetition of the word long in the phrase long, short, long, which makes the stone's life appear to be more drawn out and agonizing than enjoyable. The visual prosody of a repeated cycle for each stanza represents the life cycle of the stones. However, it is important to note that even in the hyperbole of 100 years, no thirst disturbs the stones.
Metaphorically saying that something can appear innocent, young, and healthy, but could have endured a tiring and troublesome past filled with both bitter, cold, and blazing fires. Nothing is ever as it may originally seem. The message is conveyed through visual and slightly tactile imagery, as well as a sentimental and somber tone, as Plath reflects on her own Parkstones, which helps to epitomize the point that the human nature fails to encompass all details of one's life, but rather judges them based on their outer and often masked appearance. In Landowners, Sylvia Plath displays a message about adventure and life's endless list of possibilities. Although a small poem, its meaning is quite the opposite. Through her descriptive words and particular syntactical structure, Plath makes a statement on the tendency of people to dream of being somewhere else.
In the first half of the poem, the narrator is describing their view from their small rented attic. They see a line of houses that all look identical, and Plath's diction makes it clear that the narrator's attitude toward the houses is negative. She uses words with negative connotations like inane, leaden, and spectral to describe her view from her house. This reveals that the narrator feels like everything around her is the same, a replica. Then, in the second half of the poem, the narrator describes their dreams of a landowner. Plath describes life as its own vaporous wayfarings, which has a much more positive connotation than anything in the first stanza that dealt with the narrator's current position. As Plath goes on to describe how landowners have more freedom because they own their own land, the mood shifts completely, and it's almost as if the narrator has been caught daydreaming. The syntactical structure of landowners does not appear to be very organized upon first glance. However, after taking a closer look, it becomes evident that the words are placed in their position for a reason. In the middle of the poem, where the shift occurs, Plath places the line, "but landowners," by itself. She does this to introduce the comparison she is about to make between her own life and the life of a landowner. She also juxtaposes life and death in the last two lines of the poem, making them parallel in structure and right next to each other. Their placement makes it easier to notice and to understand the juxtaposition that is taking place. By describing her home in a bleak way and then describing life as its own vaporous wayfarings, Plath makes clear her opinion that she believes life has a lot to offer. She describes it in a mysterious way, adding eagerness to find out what awaits someone who chooses to go on one of life's many adventures.
Man's Praise of Sobriety by William Yeats discusses the opposing potential outcomes of decisions made throughout one's life. The words drunk and sober are tossed around throughout this poem, although they are referring to a state of mind and respect rather than the level of consumption of alcohol.
There is a hefty usage of clever both literary and syntactical devices in this poem that help to derive the message conveyed. The phrase, "Oh, mind your feet," is repeated to show the constant struggle of not getting mixed in with the drunks of society and making the decisions that would lead them to begin a downward spiral and therefore not amount to much beyond the so-called alcohol. The phrase, "pretty punk," contains alliterations, which draws attention to the paradox in the phrase due to the opposing connotations of the two words, especially when the author decides that, at the end of the poem, there is a mermaid rather than a punk, which elevates the mermaid, or prior punk, to a status above that of the drunkards. The metaphor, sobriety is a jewel, illustrates that true mental sobriety is rare among the societal norms during the time period in which this poem.
The detail introduced in this poem that a drunkard is a dead man and all dead men are drunk helps the reader to further understand the lifeless qualities that a man possesses while he is drunk. It is noted that a man may drink but maintain a sober mindset and lifestyle due to the adoration of sobriety. The cautious yet noble and somewhat detached ironic tone shows that the author views himself as a more commendable figure who continues to dance while others fall to the alcohol and start to merely lie and snore. Beyond the literal, the meaning of this poem is to show how those who keep a level head and ambitions tend to achieve more respect and meaning from life than those who bog their minds with hindrances to their performances and potential, thus wasting away from society as a whole and their own life. The generalizations made about those who choose not to remain sober or level-headed all have negative connotations, such as the phrase "drunkards lie and snore," which illustrates the laziness and the lack of respect that society has for the drunks of life.